Welcome back. Let's read some more. Oh, I never get finished. I have many hundreds aircraft I like to read about. It's soon at 8 p.m. So I like to finish, read about all the airliners. Yes, I'm sorry for the noise from my computer. That's the electric blower. The electric blower from my computer is damaged, make noise like old air conditioning. So I need a minute to get to my bed.
Boeing 747. The Boeing 747 is a long-range wide-body airliner designed and manufactured by Boeing Commercial Airplanes in the United States between 1968 and 2023. After introducing the 707 in October 1958, Pan Am wanted a jet 2 plus 1.2 times its size, to reduce its seat cost by 30%. In 1965, Joe Sutter left the 737 development program to design the 747. In April 1966, Pan Am ordered 25 Boeing 747-100 aircraft, and in late 1966, Pratt & Whitney agreed to develop the JT9D engine, a high-bypass turbofan. On the 30th of September 1968, the first 747 was rolled out of the custom-built Everett plant, the world's largest building by volume. The 747's first flight took place on the 9th of February 1969, and the 747 was certified in December of that year. It entered service with Pan Am on the 22nd of January 1970. The 747 was the first airplane called a jumbo jet as the first wide-body airliner. The 747 is a four-engine jet aircraft, initially powered by Pratt & Whitney JT9D turbofan engines, then General Electric CF6 and Rolls-Royce RB211 engines for the original variants. With a 10-abreast economy seating, it typically accommodates 366 passengers in 3 travel classes. It has a pronounced 37.5 degrees wing sweep, allowing a Mach 0.85, 490 kN, 900 km per hour, cruise speed, and its heavy weight is supported by 4 main landing gear legs, each with a 4-wheel bogie. The partial double-deck aircraft was designed with a raised cockpit so it could be converted to a freighter airplane by installing a front cargo door, as it was initially thought that it would eventually be superseded by supersonic transports. Boeing introduced the -200 in 1971, with uprated engines for a heavier maximum takeoff weight, of 833,000 pounds. 378 t, from the initial 735,000 pounds, 333 t, increasing the maximum range from 4,620 to 6,560 nautical miles, mi, 8,560 to 12,150 kilometers, 5,320 to 7,550 mi. It was shortened for the longer-range 747 SP in 1976, and the 747-300 followed in 1983 with a stretched upper deck for up to 400 seats in 3 classes. The heavier 747-400 with improved RB211 and CF6 engines for the new PW4000 engine, the JT9D successor, and a 2-crew glass cockpit, was introduced in 1989 and is the most common variant. After several studies, the stretched 747-8 was launched on the 14th of November, 2005, with new General Electric GX engines, and was first delivered in October 2011. The 747 is the basis for several government and military variants, such as the VC-25, Air Force One, E-4 Emergency Airborne Command Post, shuttle carrier aircraft, and some experimental testbeds such as the Yul-1 and Sophia Airborne Observatory. Initial competition came from the smaller tri-J widebodies, the Lockheed L-1011, introduced in 1972, McDonnell Douglas DC-10, 1971, and later MD-11, 1990. Airbus competed with later variants with the heaviest versions of the A340 until surpassing the 747 in size with the A380, delivered between 2007 and 2021. Freighter variants of the 747 remain popular with cargo airlines. The final 747 was delivered to Atlas Air in January 2023 after a 54-year production run, with 1,574 aircraft built. As of December 2023, 64 Boeing 747s, 4.1%, have been lost in accidents and incidents, in which a total of 3,746 people have died. Development, edit. Background, edit. In 1963, the United States Air Force started a series of study projects on a very large strategic transport aircraft. Although the C-141 Starlifter was being introduced, officials believed that a much larger and more capable aircraft was needed, especially to carry cargo that would not fit in any existing aircraft. These studies led to initial requirements for the CX Heavy Logistics System, CXHLS, in March 1964 for an aircraft with a load capacity of 180,000 pounds, 81.6 t, and a speed of Mach 0.75. 430 km, 800 km per hour, and an unrefueled range of 5,000 nautical miles, 9,300 km, 5,800 mi, with a payload of 115,000 pounds, 52.2 t. The payload bay had to be 17 feet, 5.18 m, wide by 13.5 feet, 4.11 m, high and 100 feet, 30 m, long with access through doors at the front and rear. The desire to keep the number of engines to 4 required new engine designs with greatly increased power and better fuel economy. In May 1964, airframe proposals arrived from Boeing, Douglas, General Dynamics, Lockheed, and Martin Marietta. Engine proposals were submitted by General Electric, Curtiss-Wright, and Pratt & Whitney. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed were given additional study contracts for the airframe, along with General Electric and Pratt & Whitney for the engines. The airframe proposals shared several features. As the CXHLS needed to be able to be loaded from the front, a door had to be included where the cockpit usually was. All of the companies solved this problem by moving the cockpit above the cargo area. Douglas had a small pod just forward and above the wing. Lockheed used a long spine running the length of the aircraft with the wing spar passing through it, while Boeing blended the two, with a longer pod that ran from just behind the nose to just behind the wing. In 1965, Lockheed's aircraft design and General Electric's engine design were selected for the new C-5 Galaxy transport, which was the largest military aircraft in the world at the time. Boeing carried the nose door and raised cockpit concepts over to the design of the 747. Airliner proposal, edit. The 747 was conceived while air travel was increasing in the 1960s. The era of commercial jet transportation, led by the enormous popularity of the Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8, had revolutionized long-distance travel. In this growing jet age, Ron Tripp, president of Pan Am, one of Boeing's most important airline customers, asked for a new jet airliner to plus 1.2 times size of the 707, with a 30% lower cost per unit of passenger distance and the capability to offer mass air travel on international routes. Tripp also thought that airport congestion could be addressed by a larger new aircraft. In 1965, Joe Sutter was transferred from Boeing's 737 development team to manage the design studies for the new airliner, already assigned the model number 747. Sutter began a design study with Pan Am and other airlines to better understand their requirements. At the time, many thought that long-range subsonic airliners would eventually be superseded by supersonic transport aircraft. Boeing responded by designing the 747 so it could be adapted easily to carry freight and remain in production even if sales of the passenger version declined. In April 1966, Pan Am ordered 25 Boeing 747-100 aircraft for US $525 million, equivalent to $3.8 billion in 2023 dollars. During the ceremonial 747 contract signing banquet in Seattle on Boeing's 50th anniversary, Ron Tripp predicted that the 747 would be a great weapon for peace, competing with intercontinental missiles for mankind's destiny. As launch customer, and because of its early involvement before placing a formal order, Pan Am was able to influence the design and development of the 747 to an extent unmatched by a single airline before or since. Design effort, edit. Ultimately, the high-winged CXHLS Boeing design was not used for the 747, although technologies developed for their bid had an influence. The original design included a full-length double-deck fuselage with 8 across seating and 2 aisles on the lower deck and 7 across seating and 2 aisles on the upper deck. However, concern over evacuation routes and limited cargo carrying capability caused this idea to be scrapped in early 1966 in favor of a wider single-deck design. The cockpit was therefore placed on a shortened upper deck so that a freight loading door could be included in the nose cone. This design feature produced the 747's distinctive hump. In early models, what to do with the small space in the pod behind the cockpit was not clear, and this was initially specified as a lounge area with no permanent seating. A different configuration that had been considered to keep the flight deck out of the way for freight loading had the pilots below the passengers, and was dubbed the anteater dot. One of the principal technologies that enabled an aircraft as large as the 747 to be drawn up was the high-bypass turbofan engine. This engine technology was thought to be capable of delivering double the power of the earlier turbojets while consuming 1/3 less fuel. General Electric had pioneered the concept but was committed to developing the engine for the C-5 Galaxy and did not enter the commercial market until later. Pratt & Whitney was also working on the same principle and, by late 1966, Boeing, Pan Am and Pratt & Whitney agreed to develop a new engine, designated the JT9D to power the 747. The project was designed with a new methodology called fault tree analysis, which allowed the effects of a failure of a single part to be studied to determine its impact on other systems. To address concerns about safety and flyability, the 747's design included structural redundancy, redundant hydraulic systems, quadruple main landing gear and dual control surfaces. Additionally, some of the most advanced high-lift devices used in the industry were included in the new design, to allow it to operate from existing airports. These included Kruger flaps running almost the entire length of the wing's leading edge, as well as complex three-part slotted flaps along the trailing edge of the wing. The wing's complex three-part flaps increase wing area by 21% and lift by 90% when fully deployed compared to their non-deployed configuration. Boeing agreed to deliver the first 747 to Pan Am by the end of 1969. The delivery date left 28 months to design the aircraft, which was 2/3 of the normal time. The schedule was so fast-paced that the people who worked on it were given the nickname the Incredibles. Developing the aircraft was such a technical and financial challenge that management was said to have bet the company when it started the project. Due to its massive size, Boeing subcontracted the assembly of subcomponents to other manufacturers, most notably Northrop and Grumman, later merged into Northrop Grumman in 1994, for fuselage parts and trailing edge flaps respectively, Fairchild for tailplane ailerons, and Lintemco-Vout, LTV, for the empennage. Production plant, edit. As Boeing did not have a plant large enough to assemble the giant airliner, they chose to build a new plant. The company considered locations in about 50 cities, and eventually decided to build the new plant some 30 miles, 50 kilometers, north of Seattle on a site adjoining a military base at Payne Field near Everett, Washington. It bought the 780-acre, 320-ha site in June 1966. Developing the 747 had been a major challenge, and building its assembly plant was also a huge undertaking. Boeing President William M. Allen asked Malcolm T. Stamper, then head of the company's turbine division, to oversee construction of the Everett factory and to start production of the 747. To level the site, more than 4 million cubic yards, 3 million cubic meters, of earth had to be moved. Time was so short that the 747's full-scale mock-up was built before the factory roof above it was finished. The plant is the largest building by volume ever built, and has been substantially expanded several times to permit construction of other models of Boeing wide-body commercial jets. Flight testing, edit. Before the first 747 was fully assembled, testing began on many components and systems. One important test involved the evacuation of 560 volunteers from a cabin mock-up via the aircraft's emergency chutes. The first full-scale evacuation took 2.5 minutes instead of the maximum of 90 seconds mandated by the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, and several volunteers were injured. Subsequent test evacuations achieved the 90-second goal but caused more injuries. Most problematic was evacuation from the aircraft's upper deck. Instead of using a conventional slide, volunteer passengers escaped by using a harness attached to a reel. Tests also involved taxiing such a large aircraft. Boeing built an unusual training device known as Waddle's Wagon, named for a 747 test pilot, Jack Waddle, that consisted of a mock-up cockpit mounted on the roof of a truck. While the first 747s were still being built, the device allowed pilots to practice taxi maneuvers from a high upper deck position. In 1968, the program cost was $1 billion, equivalent to $6.7 billion in 2023 dollars. On the 30th of September, 1968, the first 747 was rolled out of the Everett Assembly Building before the world's press and representatives of the 26 airlines that had ordered the airliner. Over the following months, preparations were made for the first flight, which took place on the 9th of February, 1969, with test pilots Jack Waddell and Brian Wiggle at the controls and Jess Wallach at the flight engineers station. Despite a minor problem with one of the flaps, the flight confirmed that the 747 handled extremely well. The 747 was found to be largely immune to Dutch roll, a phenomenon that had been a major hazard to the early swept-wing jets. Issues, delays and certification, edit. During later stages of the flight test program, flutter testing showed that the wings suffered oscillation under certain conditions. This difficulty was partly solved by reducing the stiffness of some wing components. However, a particularly severe high-speed flutter problem was solved only by inserting depleted uranium counterweights as ballast in the outboard engine nacelles of the early 747s. This measure caused anxiety when these aircraft crashed. For example, LL Flight 1862 at Amsterdam in 1992 with 622 pounds, 282 kilograms, of uranium in the tailplane, horizontal stabilizer. The flight test program was hampered by problems with the 747's JT9D engines. Difficulties included engine stalls caused by rapid throttle movements and distortion of the turbine casings after a short period of service. The problems delayed 747 deliveries for several months. Up to 20 aircraft at the Everett plant were stranded while awaiting engine installation. The program was further delayed when one of the 5 test aircraft suffered serious damage during a landing attempt at Renton Municipal Airport, the site of Boeing's Renton factory. The incident happened on the 13th of December, 1969, when a test aircraft was flown to Renton to have test equipment removed and a cabin installed. Pilot Ralph C. Coakley undershot the airport's short runway and the 747's right outer landing gear was torn off and 2 engine nacelles were damaged. However, these difficulties did not prevent Boeing from taking a test aircraft to the 28th Paris Air Show in mid-1969, where it was displayed to the public for the first time. Finally, in December 1969, the 747 received its FAA airworthiness certificate, clearing it for introduction into service. The huge cost of developing the 747 and building the Everett factory meant that Boeing had to borrow heavily from a banking syndicate. During the final months before delivery of the first aircraft, the company had to repeatedly request additional funding to complete the project. Had this been refused, Boeing's survival would have been threatened. The firm's debt exceeded $2 billion, with the $1.2 billion owed to the banks setting a record for all companies. Allen later said, "It was really too large a project for us." Ultimately, the gamble succeeded, and Boeing held a monopoly in very large passenger aircraft production for many years. Entry into service, edit. On the 15th of January, 1970, First Lady Pat Nixon christened Pan Am's first 747 at Dulles International Airport in the presence of Pan Am Chairman Najib Halabi. Instead of champagne, red, white, and blue water was sprayed on the aircraft. The 747 entered service on the 22nd of January, 1970, on Pan Am's New York-London route. The flight had been planned for the evening of the 21st of January, but engine overheating made the original aircraft, Clipper Young America, registration N735 PA, unusable. Finding a substitute delayed the flight by more than 6 hours to the following day when Clipper Victor, registration N736 PA, was used. The 747 enjoyed a fairly smooth introduction into service, overcoming concerns that some airports would not be able to accommodate an aircraft that large. Although technical problems occurred, they were relatively minor and quickly solved. Improved 747 versions, edit. After the initial 747-100, Boeing developed the -100B, a higher maximum takeoff weight, MTO, variant, and the -100SR, short range, with higher passenger capacity. Increased maximum takeoff weight allows aircraft to carry more fuel and have longer range. The -200 model followed in 1971, featuring more powerful engines and a higher MTO. Passenger, freighter and combination passenger freighter versions of the -200 were produced. The shortened 747 SP, Special Performance, with a longer range was also developed, and entered service in 1976. The 747 line was further developed with the launch of the 747-300 on the 11th of June, 1980, followed by interest from Swissair a month later and the go-ahead for the project. The 300 series resulted from Boeing studies to increase the seating capacity of the 747, during which modifications such as fuselage plugs and extending the upper deck over the entire length of the fuselage were rejected. The first 747-300, completed in 1983, included a stretched upper deck, increased cruise speed, and increased seating capacity. The -300 variant was previously designated 747 SUD for stretched upper deck, then 747-200 SUD, followed by 747 EUD, before the 747-300 designation was used. Passenger, short-range and combination freighter passenger versions of the 300 series were produced. In 1985, development of the longer-range 747-400 began. The variant had a new glass cockpit, which allowed for a cockpit crew of 2 instead of 3, new engines, lighter construction materials, and a redesigned interior. Development costs soared, and production delays occurred as new technologies were incorporated at the request of airlines. Insufficient workforce experience and reliance on overtime contributed to early production problems on the 747-400. The -400 entered service in 1989. In 1991, a record-breaking 1,087 passengers were flown in a 747 during a covert operation to airlift Ethiopian Jews to Israel. Generally, the 747-400 held between 416 and 524 passengers. The 747 remained the heaviest commercial aircraft in regular service until the debut of the Antonov An-124 Ruslan in 1982. Variants of the 747-400 surpassed the An-124's weight in 2000. The Antonov An-225 Mriya cargo transport, which debuted in 1988, remains the world's largest aircraft by several measures, including the most accepted measures of maximum takeoff weight and length. One aircraft has been completed and was in service until 2022. The scaled composite Stratolaunch is currently the largest aircraft by wingspan. Further developments, edit. After the arrival of the 747-400, several stretching schemes for the 747 were proposed. Boeing announced the larger 747-500X and -600X preliminary designs in 1996. The new variants would have cost more than $5 billion to develop, and interest was not sufficient to launch the program. In 2000, Boeing offered the more modest 747X and 747X stretch derivatives as alternatives to the Airbus A38X. However, the 747X family was unable to attract enough interest to enter production. A year later, Boeing switched from the 747X studies to pursue the Sonic Cruiser, and after the Sonic Cruiser program was put on hold, the 787 Dreamliner. Some of the ideas developed for the 747X were used on the 747-400, a longer-range variant.